Howdy folks, what's going on? Today we're going to be making this really fun effect that combines a 3D displacement effect with our Kinect depth data and kind of creates this cool almost 3D pixel sorting effect where the edge color of whatever is in our depth image is going to get stretched all the way back into infinity. So there's a lot of fun stuff you can do with this, whether you're taking 3D silhouettes or even just making some cool art or taking this and editing this. So what we're going to do is delete everything and start again from scratch. So the first thing we're going to do is make our Kinect Azure top here. And like we talked about in our last video getting started with Kinect Azure, this is kind of like the funnel operator that collects all of the information from our device and brings it into TouchDesigner. I want my image to be in depth mode because we're going to be using that depth texture to basically displace and warp a grid. And I also know that I want to get my Kinect Azure's color image. Now, in this case, we don't want to make another Kinect Azure because remember, you're only going to make one Kinect Azure top per device. So when I'm trying to get a different set of data from the same device, I'm going to use the Kinect Azure select top, and I can just drag and drop my main Kinect Azure top onto that Kinect Azure top parameter of the Kinect Azure select. Say Kinect Azure really fast a bunch of times is not very easy, I'll tell you that. So in this case, the default image it's going to grab is the point cloud. So I'm going to click on that and change it over to color because I want my color image. Now don't mind the little bit of glitching effects here. My laptop's USB is not very happy with how many things are plugged in right now, but we can still make all of this just fine. Now, like we talked about in the last video, one of the really nice things is because we want our depth camera essentially to be our main focus of this effect, I want to line up and automatically have my color image aligned and matching with my depth texture. And I can do that by going to the Kinect Azure select top and going to align image to other camera and turning that on. What that's going to do is behind the scenes, the Kinect Azure SDK is going to say, oh, well, the other image here is a depth image. So I'm going to go ahead and warp all of that to match the Kinect Azure's depth. So that's really great and saves us a lot of hassle because these are now automatically going to line up. Now I'm going to go ahead and drop a null top here, and that's just going to grab my color data because we don't really need to do anything with our color data in this case. Just what we have here is probably going to be enough. And there's a few steps we have to do with our depth image. Now there are a lot of ways you could kind of clean up this depth image with native tops, but I find this is really where one line of GLSL can make your life so much easier. We have another video on our YouTube about how to basically trim point clouds, and that same technique can apply here. So even if you don't know GLSL, don't worry, we're going to go through it really slow and you can follow along. So I'm going to go ahead and make a GLSL top, and I'm going to plug my Kinect Azure's depth into that first input. And I'm going to right click and edit my GLSL1 pixel script here. Now, what I can do here is, first of all, we almost don't even need to worry about half of the things inside of the script. The first thing we're going to do is delete line 10 because this sets the color to be white for every pixel, and we don't want that. I'm going to delete the 2 forward slashes on line 9 here, so that way it turns the commented code into real code. And the only thing I'm going to do is quickly just make a simple if statement, because if we remember about depth images here, this is all data. So what I want to do is say if a pixel value is lower than a certain threshold, which is going to be my close threshold, get rid of it. And if it's higher than a certain value, which is basically going to be anything past my body here, so the background, I also want to get rid of that pixel and throw it way far in the background. So what I'll do is go back to my script here and I'll start an if statement, open a set of parentheses, and now here I can set my condition inside of these parentheses. So I can say if my color.r, which basically means my color red channel, and because these are mono textures, the only channel we have is the red channel, we can say is less than 0. Now, we can also make this really easy by doing both the checking of the close plane and the far plane at the same time. And the way we do this is with an OR. Now, inside of GLSL, if we put two of these kind of up and down lines, which usually on most keyboards is right above the Enter key. So if you hit Shift / on most keyboards, that's going to give you that character. And we'll say if the color.r is also greater than, and we'll start with a value like 3 for now. So essentially this one line says, hey, if our depth value is less than 0 or it's greater than 3, execute what we're going to put in this next block here. Now with GLSL, when we finish our condition here, what we're going to do is put a set of squiggly brackets, and you can really style these however you want. GLSL is not a language that really cares about spacing, so you could open a set of squiggly brackets and close them on different lines. You'll see some code editors will automatically do something like this, where it opens it at the end of the condition and closes it later. It doesn't really matter, and you can go ahead and copy exactly just as it is on my screen. And then the final thing we have to do is, once we're inside this if statement, what are we going to do with that pixel? Now, in this case, what I'm going to do is set the color. I'm going to set that whole value to be a vec4. And basically what this does is it says, hey, give me a new vector4, which is just an RGBA pairing of values, and set all of them to something like 100.0. At the end of that line, I'm just going to put a semicolon, and I'm going to save that. Now, in this case, we haven't seen anything changed yet, but once we saved it, we can see that at least there's no errors. Now, if you have any errors so far, just pause the screen here. We'll make our code a little bit bigger for you, and just copy that line for line. Now, if you're working on maybe a different GPU, you might experience a little bit of different behavior, or maybe you might get a couple of errors inside of the GLSL info. Just let us know in the comments and we can help you get that sorted out. But in this case, the reason we're not seeing anything change in our GLSL shader is because all of the values are more than 0 and less than 3. So if we start to clamp down on this range, we're going to see different parts of, whether it's my background or things that are close to the camera, start to get cut off. So for example, I can set my close plane to be maybe 0.2 and save it. And now you can see as I get close to the camera, all of a sudden that becomes white instead of going black like it used to. And what I can do is even start to bring this far plane a little bit closer until it starts to cut me out a little bit. So instead of 3, maybe I'll do 2. And we can see it hasn't really affected me yet. So what about 1? Hasn't affected me yet. So what about 0.8 or 0.5? Oh, now we can see, now that I did 0.5, that's basically cut off from right about where my shoulder ends here. So I'm going to bring that value up a little bit, maybe 0.6. And it seems like 0.7 gives me a safe distance that goes just about to behind me. And I might even go up to 0.8 here, just to give myself a little bit of leeway. So we can see as I move my arm farther away from the camera, right about here, my elbow starts to disappear, and then my hand disappears into that white pixel. So that's great. In just 2 lines of code here, we've created a really nice way of just filtering our data and getting rid of that extra data that we don't need. Now from here, the main trick that we're going to use today is a bit of displacement on a material. Now, if you've never done this before, it's super easy to do and super cool things that you can do with it. So I'll go ahead and just start building this little system. So I'll make a Phong MAT, and we're going to be needing a normal map, a color map, and then a height map. Now we already have our color here, so I can even just go ahead and grab this null one, drag it onto the color map, and now I need a normal map. So what I could do, let me make a little bit of room here by moving everything over, is use the very helpful normal map top. And what this does is it allows us to pipe in some kind of texture. So let's say, for example, the output of this GLSL, and generate a quick normal map for it. Now, one thing to be careful of, especially when you're working with things like the Kinect Azure depth image, by default, it is a 32-bit float mono signal. That means if you send it down into other kinds of operators, like the normal map, it's only going to stay as a 32-bit mono texture. And in most cases, after you're done this step of creating this little GLSL shader that trims your data, you're probably going to want to change all the operators after that back into 8-bit RGB or 32-bit RGB pixels. So in this case, for my normal, I'm just going to go to common page of parameters, and I'm going to change the pixel format into an 8-bit fixed RGBA. And now that's going to look more like a normal map that you're used to maybe seeing. So I can go over to my Phong material again, drag and drop this normal map onto the normal map parameter, and then I'm going to click Enable Height Map. Now it's looking for my height map, which in this case really is just my GLSL top output. So I'll go ahead and make a null top here and connect the GLSL top to that. And I'll drag and drop that height map onto the height map parameter. So now the final thing I need to do here is turn on my displace vertices and now give this material something to actually displace. So in this case, I'll make a very simple grid sop. And the fun thing about this effect is that you can actually change it and do whatever kind of shape you want, because TouchDesigner really doesn't care what kind of geometry you use. You could use a grid sop, you could use a sphere sop, you could use a torus, and as long as you kind of relatively have the right amount of points, everything's going to work perfectly fine. Now in this case, I'm going to set my project to go 1 for 1 so that every point in the grid corresponds to one of the pixels inside of my texture. So in this case, if I middle click on my texture here, I can see it's 640 by 576. Now, if you're using maybe an older laptop or maybe your computer doesn't have as much horsepower, you're going to want to divide this number by half or even a quarter before entering it into the rows and columns that I'm about to enter. Otherwise, you're going to have a giant geometry and it's going to slow your machine right down. So what I'm going to do is, like I said, 640 by 576. So on my grid sop here, my columns are going to be 640 and my rows are going to be 576. So like I said, if you're working on a little bit of an older machine or maybe your personal machine, go ahead and just divide these by 2 or even 4 before entering them in there. Because what we can see is 640 by 576 gives us almost 370,000 points. Well, actually, no, almost 370,000 points inside of this grid. Now, that's one of the beauties of this technique is how well it scales. So whether it's 370,000 points, 50,000 points, 500,000 points, because all of the displacement happens on the GPU, it's even going to be able to run on my Razer laptop here. So the final thing I really need to do is take this material and apply it to this geometry. So we know when we want to do that, I'm going to go ahead and right click on the output of my SOP here, switch over to the comp family, and create a geometry comp. And that's just a really quick and easy way to automatically make a geometry comp, create the in, wire in your geometry, and set its render and display flag. So that's a really great pro trick and tip that speeds up your render setup workflows a lot. So now that I have this Phong ready here, I can go to my geocomp, go to the render page of parameters, and I'm going to drag and drop this Phong MAT onto material. And I can go ahead and see that my effect is really getting close to being finished here. Now, there's a couple of things that you can go ahead and do, and this is all starting to become personal preference, and you can kind of explore and play with different effects. The first thing you might want to do is go up to the Phong material here, and I find on its parameters, I like to turn up the constant value here. Now, you could set up lights and have it be a little bit more well lit, but in my case, I like to kind of turn this up and just ensure that there's at least some pixel color traveling down the kind of pixel sorting looking element of it, even if there's no light in the scene. Now, you may also want to play with things like the displacement scale, which is going to either kind of limit that amount of displacement that is being occurred. Like we can see here, it's actually almost flat now. Or we can turn that up and you can see it starts to make it more and more 3D. And you can even take this to some really crazy extremes and really stretch people out in a cool and interesting way. Now, another thing that you might be interested in doing here is going back to our GLSL material here. And sometimes I find adding a little bit of blur to the depth map just really helps kind of smooth out some of those edges. So what I could do is after my GLSL top and before my null top here, I'm going to right click on the wire, select insert operator, and find a blur top. Now I can take that blur top and I have its parameters open as I'm looking at my scene here, I could start to do things like increase or decrease the blur and see the kinds of effects it has on this image. So I like to add just a tiny bit of blur because it helps smooth out those images, and it really feels like we can see my ear here is really getting dragged out in a fun and interesting way. Let me see here. So I like to add a little bit of blur. You can also go ahead to your grid, and like we're saying, you could either keep it as a mesh or change it over to something like a polygon and set the connectivity to be triangles. It's going to give you a slightly different look on how it blends. Sometimes this might feel a little bit smoother, sometimes it might feel pretty much the same, but it just gives you a couple of options there. Now, aside from that, this effect is pretty much built, and you can do so many different things with it. For example, you could go ahead and change what's happening with the color image coming in. You could go here where we're setting this value of vec4 to 100 and change that to something else. So for example, if I open up this script again, and let's go over and watch and see what happens as I change that value. We can see if I set this as something like 10, all of a sudden we can actually see the end of the trail here, and we can see it kind of compresses a lot of that color image. And if I do something like 1, it starts to bring it almost back to, we can almost even see that backplane there. You could go in the negative direction as well, so I could say go negative 100, and that's kind of going to pull me in the other direction, so I almost have an inside-out depth map here, which is a little bit trippy to look at, and then it pulls me forward, and I can even go inside of it and look through that little halo. Hello there. So there's a lot of fun stuff you can do with this. It's really simple to set up, and it's a really effective technique that you can use inside of your systems, especially with sensors like the Kinect or the RealSense, or even things like the Ouster. So with that said, I hope you enjoy this fun effect.
Hey guys, thanks for watching. If you're serious about taking your TouchDesigner and interactive skills to the next level, I highly recommend you check out the Interactive and Immersive HQ Pro. It's the only educational resource and community of its kind for TouchDesigner and interactive professionals. You can learn more by checking out the link in the description. And if you like this video, don't forget to hit that like button. And if you're new here, don't forget to hit subscribe and the little bell icon for more awesome free content.